On session, Honorable Kathleen K. Powell, Judge of Fire.
Good morning. We're once again on the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. The people are represented. Mr. Matheson, if you retake the stand, I remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Matheson.
Good morning.
I think where we left off yesterday, you indicated that you tested item number 49, which was the blood drop from the trail left at 875 South Bundy, shown in close-up in photograph E. Excuse me, E or D? E. And shown in perspective in photograph D. You recall saying that?
That's correct.
And you tested that initially to determine if it was of human origin?
Yes.
And with respect to the blood samples that were retrieved from the defendant and from Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, with respect to those samples, did you test them also?
Yes, I did.
What tests did you perform on those?
On those, I performed the ABO blood typing test, the Group 1 enzyme electrophoresis test, and the PGM subtype electrophoresis test.
And did you also subject the blood drop from the trail, item number 49, to those same tests?
Yes, I did.
Did you prepare a chart, sir, indicating what you found?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have a chart I previously shown to the defense as it marked People 24.
All right.
Showing you People 24, sir. Recognize what I'm showing you?
Yes, I do.
What does that chart show us?
Well, just a summary of the results of the analytical tests that were performed on those items.
With respect to the ABO typing performed on each of the blood samples, with respect to the blood from Nicole Simpson Brown, item number 59, the ABO typing result was?
That I determined that she was a type A.
And as for Ronald Goldman, item number 60?
In that case, I determined that the results indicate that he's a type O.
And as to the defendant, item number 17?
That he is a type A.
And as to item number 49, the blood drop?
That the tests indicate that it is of a type A.
Now, what do you mean when you say indicates?
Well, during the course of ABO typing, there's actually two different constituents that are present in the blood that can determine what the ABO type is. One of them is called antigen, and the other is called an antibody. If we only determine one of those two, we call it indicative of. If we're able to determine the presence of both the antigen and the antibody, and they confirm the type, then we just call it a type A, or a type O, or a type AB, or type B, depending on whatever it turns out to be.
Does that mean when you say indicative of O that it might not be O?
No, it just means that I was only able to, either only one of the tests worked or I only ran one of the tests. It just was not able to confirm the results with the other one.
Have you performed ABO testing before, sir?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
Well, I didn't break it. There's a variety of different type of ABO tests. I didn't break it down to the individual ones, but in my career so far, I've run an ABO typing test a little over 6,500 times.
In those 6,500 times, have you had the experience of doing the initial run for ABO typing and come up with an indication of a type, as you've indicated here, like indicative of A or indicative of O, and then had an opportunity to run the second test on the antibodies to confirm that result later?
Yes.
In any of those cases, did it turn out that the initial indicative of type, whether it be O, A, or A, B, or B, turned out to be wrong?
I don't know if I would say turned out to be wrong. Occasionally there are discrepancies that occur between the two, and then we come up with what's called an inconclusive result. Normally, you can, through further testing, try and decide or determine why it may not have come out as clearly as you expected. But occasionally it does happen where your first indication, your first test is not how it's eventually reported.
And how often does that happen?
I don't have a number. It happens fairly rarely.
Now, in this case, after the ABO typing, did you perform further typing?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
Well, there was additional test run that I mentioned before, the enzyme group 1 test, which includes actually 3 different enzymes in one process. One of them is the ESD or esterase D that's indicated on the chart. Another is PGM or phosphoglucomutase. And the third is GLO or glyoxylase. Those 3 enzymes are all run in one process.
With respect to the Nicole Simpson Brown sample, item number 59, what was the ESD result?
A type 1.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, item number 60, what was the result?
Also a type 1.
And with respect to the defendant, item number 17?
Also was determined to be a type 1.
And with respect to item number 49, the blood drop?
That was also determined to be a type 1.
Thus far, with respect to the markers that you found in item number 49, excuse me, item number 49, would it be a fair statement that only Ronald Goldman's could be excluded from having been the source of that blood drop?
If our only population are the 3 people that are being described here, yes, he's the only one of those 3 that can currently be excluded as being the source of that blood drop.
Then you performed the PGM subtype test?
Yes.
And the result with respect to Nicole Simpson Brown in item number 59?
I determined that she was a PGM subtype 1+,
And Ronald Goldman, item number 60?
that he was a 2+, 1+,
And the defendant, item number 17?
was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
So each of the 3 parties there are a different PGM subtype, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
With respect to item number 49, the drop of blood on the trail at 875 South Bundy, what was the PGM subtype?
The PGM subtype on that sample was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
Based on the 3 people that you see on that chart, could Nicole Simpson Brown have left the blood drop at 875 South Bundy marked item number 49?
No, with the inclusion of the PGM subtype information, she's excluded as being a source of that sample.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, based on the PGM subtype, could he have been a source of that blood drop on the trail known as item number 49 at 875 South Bundy?
No, he could not.
With respect to the defendant, could he have been the source of the blood drop that was found on the trail at 875 South Bundy, known as item number 49?
Yes, he can be included in the group of possibles.
Now, did you make some effort to determine what the frequency or number of percentage of the population that could have left the blood sample that you typed out in item number 49 as indicative of A, ESD type 1, PGM subtype 2+, 2-? What percentage of the population could have left that blood drop?
Okay, I determined that that combination of those 3 type genetic markers exists in approximately 0.43% of the general population.
Your Honor, we'll object to the admission of this evidence for lack of foundation. If the prosecution is going to offer a computation based on the multiplication of the frequency of 3 different types of or enzymes in the blood, we're going to have to show that these are independent random variables that can be multiplied, and there's been no foundation for the independence of each of these calculations.
Well, there's been no foundation as to how this particular number has been arrived at, so maybe you want to go into that.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Tell us how you arrived at that frequency, sir.
Well, within our laboratory, since actually the beginning of the serology unit, we have kept information on all the whole bloods that have been run by that unit, all the genetic marker types that have been determined on all the victims, suspects, witnesses, whatever blood sample happened to come into the laboratory. And through doing that and identifying the different types, we've been able to establish percentages of the population that have a particular type. For example, in the ABO blood typing system, we've determined that approximately 34% of the population is a type A, approximately 16% is a type B, approximately 4% is a type AB, and approximately 46% is a type O.
And how are those tables compiled, if you know?
The tables or the information is just an ongoing process. For the last approximately 10 years or so, have on a annual or semi-annual basis added up all the types that we've determined during that previous time period, added it to the quantity that we had before, and performed the calculations.
And approximately how many times have you performed such calculations, sir?
Like I said, I do it approximately annually, anywhere from 9 to 18 months, and I would say maybe 9 or 10 times we've brought it up to date.
And on how many occasions have the people in your lab testified to frequencies of types that are found in evidence stains and in various persons in courts of law?
Well, I'm not sure I can give a specific number on it. I know that I have testified personally in blood stain type cases approximately 115 times. Out of that, frequencies are brought up in at least half of those.
And in each case, was the frequency based on the tables you've mentioned using the multiplication system admitted in the court?
Yes, it has.
Is the system of multiplying each of the factors to achieve a frequency, an overall frequency, a method that is accepted in the scientific community, sir?
Yes, it is.
And then you reported that the frequency you found to be for the typing that you found in the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy was 0.43%?
Approximately that, yes.
Your Honor, if we could call the other witness.
All right.
Mr. Matheson, how many PGM subtype tests has your laboratory performed?
Well, I have specific figures on the number that I have run. I determined that I've done approximately 1,000 items by the PGM subtype method. The only information I can supply you as far as overall laboratory is since we started computerizing our statistics, which was the first part of 1990. And since then, the laboratory as a whole has done a little over 1,800 items by that method.
And you indicated that you've done about 6,500 ABO typing tests,
Yes, that's correct.
but you've done less than 1,000 PGM subtype tests.
No, slightly over 1,000, that's correct.
So you do a PGM subtype in about 1 out of 6 of the tests where you do an ABO type.
That's approximately how the math works out, yeah.
How do you select which cases you're going to do a PGM subtype?
Well, it depends an awful lot on how much sample there is to begin with. Our protocol has tended to be to do the ABO first and then go on to the electrophoresis systems. I've mentioned earlier this group 1 system, which includes PGM as one of the enzymes in it, that you normally try and run first and determine what the PGM type is, not the subtype. And if you don't get a PGM type, then there's no reason to expend further sample running the subtype system on it. So many times we don't run it.
Would you say then that there's some sort of random selection of the PGM subtypes from the larger group of ABO types that you do?
You mean as far as the ones that appear in our frequency charts or in the ones that are run?
What I'm saying is that the individual cases where you have determined to run a PGM subtype are not a random sample of the ABO type tests that you've done.
I am not totally sure what you mean by random. I do know that, we follow certain criteria as to whether we run a particular test, and it depends on the quality of the sample. The data that appears in our frequency charts is based strictly on whole blood samples, not evidence stains. And we will not run a particular marker in a whole blood sample if we don't have something to compare it to in the stain. So I'm not sure if that's random or not, but sometimes we run it, sometimes we don't.
And the frequency chart that you maintain for PGM subtype, that's just based on the PGM subtype test that you have done in your laboratory.
That's correct.
And you compute that by race of the subject that you're testing?
No, the statistics that we keep within our laboratory, the general population statistics that I've used to calculate this, do not take race into account.
So you have no race-specific frequency data for PGM subtype?
No, that's not true. The chart that I used in this case and that we use regularly on all of our analyzed evidence reports does not break it down by race. However, we do maintain reference books in the laboratory that does if it's needed.
And these reference books would refer to frequency data collected in other laboratories?
That's correct.
But you just used your own data?
Yes, we always do.
And your data is race-specific for neither the ABO nor the PGM subtype?
No, we don't determine race on any of our frequency determinations that we have. We don't feel it's our job to determine what race left a stain. We just have a stain of an unknown origin, so we choose to report a general population statistic.
But yet you're aware that there are dramatic differences in the frequency of blood type, for example, among blacks or African Americans as compared to whites.
Whether it's dramatic or not, it depends on the particular marker. I do have data here on the racial breakdown on the three genetic markers that I did run in this case, in case that information was needed.
Well, are you aware, for example, that other data suggests that type B is twice as frequent among the black population as it is among the white population?
Well, I don't know specifically what it is. I'd be happy to look it up and confirm it, but I'll accept the fact that there can be major differences, particularly in the ABO system. In the PGM subtype system, it doesn't vary quite as much as that.
You're not aware that there have been reports in PGM subtypes of ratios as great as 3 to 1 between races?
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me that if in specific populations it can vary by that much. That's one reason why up to this point I've specifically mentioned that these frequency determinations were approximations.
And what you've done in order to come up with this 0.43% or 1 in 200 is simply take your calculations of the frequency of each of the markers and then multiply them together to come up with 1 in 200?
With the 0.43, that's correct. And then I kind of rounded up for ease of understanding to approximately 1 in 200.
What is the frequency of type A that you use to multiply?
For the data that I have there, I use 33.7%.
And for the PGM subtype 2 plus 2 minus?
1.6%.
And you simply multiply those together to get the 0.43%.
Well, also included in there is the esterase D type 1, which I use 79.6%.
Now, you have made no effort to correlate the frequency of PGM subtype with the frequency of a particular result in the ABO test, have you?
Oh, you mean to see if there's any sort of correlation between the two?
Exactly.
No, within our laboratory, we have not done that. I have learned throughout my training and have been advised that they are independent.
Been advised by who?
I don't have any specific name or reference. It's just been something that's been occurred during the course of the last 12 years of my serology training. It's my understanding that they are independent factors.
But none of the testing that you have done or the accumulation of data that you have done attempts to correlate how frequently you would have a 2 plus 2 minus, for example, in an A blood sample as opposed to a B blood sample or an O blood sample or an AB blood sample.
No, within our laboratory, we have never done those calculations.
Your Honor, we would renew our objection based on People versus Collins that the multiplication of these factors is improper unless they can lay a foundation to show the independent appearance of each of these factors that they're multiplying.
Ms. Clark?
Yes, Your Honor. Counsel's raising the possibility of linkage, and I think that with maybe a little bit further questioning, I can establish that is not an issue in these particular markers. That's more an issue in other areas, if I may.
All right.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the term linkage, sir?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with any studies that discuss the possibility of linkage in the systems that you've tested for the purposes of your testimony today?
In this particular case, dealing with these factors that have been around and used for many, many years, I right here cannot specifically come up with any studies. It just is something that has existed for quite a while.
In the scientific community, has there been any concern voiced that with respect to the ESD or PGM subtype testing? I'm sorry. Where'd you leave off? Has there been any agreement concerning the existence or non-existence of linkage with respect to the ABO, ESD, and PGM subtype categories?
My understanding is there's general agreement that there is no linkage between any of these factors.
So that, as of this date, the scientific community agrees that there is not the problem of linkage that might otherwise skew the frequencies that are reported in all these cases where these particular markers are tested and found in blood types and in blood stains for the purpose of determining frequency.
That's correct. These sort of determinations have been being made and used in court for in excess of a decade.
Does the court wish me to further inquire?
No, the defense objection at this time is overruled.
Now, you indicated, sir, that you do not, the table that you like to use does not break down by race.
That's correct.
Is that a more conservative approach than focusing first on the race of a suspect and then extrapolating out from that to see what tables would be fit based on
Exactly, the characterization is conservative.
Sustained as to what that means. I think it's vague.
Oh. Why don't you like to consider race when you determine the frequencies and choose your tables?
There's actually a couple of reasons. I believe I mentioned one earlier in that as a criminalist, as a scientist, I receive a piece of evidence that is, say in this particular case, a blood stain that was left on at a crime scene. I have no knowledge of who potentially might have left that behind. I don't want to assume that it is a Caucasian or it is a black or it's Hispanic or something along that line. So I prefer to use our general frequency considerations that we do because it gives kind of a middle number where all the different races are considered within the population of the city of Los Angeles. Like I mentioned earlier, I do have statistics broken down as to how it might be given a Caucasian, black, or Hispanic. But I don't prefer to use those just for the reasons that I mentioned. Also, I feel it's important for us to have our own data that we can support, that we know where the information came from. And it's not always possible for us to receive information as to the race of an individual whose blood that we're typing. And even if we did have a process of receiving it, there's some question as to the validity of how that's determined. Does the person that's drawing the blood just look at them and make their own determination or what? So we prefer to go with the general characteristic.
If, for example, sir, you were to consider, first of all, well, the suspect is white. Therefore, I'm going to look at the tables for white people concerning the frequency of each marker that you're testing. Does that basically begin by narrowing the focus, by making the assumption that your evidence stain will be from a white person?
That's correct.
And in that regard, sir, then might that distort the frequency to make it unfairly more incriminating than you otherwise might have if you did not make any assumptions about the possible source of a blood stain?
Well, Depending on how it happens to work out for that race, it could be either more or less incriminating.
But either way, it might distort your result if you were to narrow the focus by making an assumption that the person who left a stain is of the same race as the suspect.
That's correct.
And you did not do that in this case.
Not for purposes of the report or the chart.
Now, I take it, sir, then, that you found, as you reported, that the types detected in the blood drop of item 49 left on the trail at 875 South Bundy occurs in 0.43% of the population?
Approximately 0.43, that's correct.
And who among the three that you have listed in the chart marked Peoples 24 could possibly have been the source of that stain?
Of the three people that are described both in my report and on the report, only Mr. Simpson can be included in that percentage of the population that could have left that stain.
So Mr. Simpson alone is included in the 0.43% of the population that could have left the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy?
Of the three people that are mentioned on the chart, that's correct.
Then by my math, we may, if my math is any good, we may fairly say that 99.57% of the population is excluded as a possible source of the blood drop found on the trail at 875 South Bundy, marked as item number 49.
That's correct.
I have nothing further.
Mr. Ullman.
Mr. Matheson, the frequency tables that you rely on, you indicate, are based on the tests that are done in your own laboratory.
That's correct.
And you accumulate this data over a long period of time.
Yes.
Now, as a police laboratory, the tests that you conduct ordinarily are people who have been arrested as criminal suspects or the victims of criminal activity.
That's true.
That's not a random sample that is representative of the population as a whole, is it?
No, it is not. It's, like you mentioned, victims and suspects in the city of Los Angeles.
And in fact, ethnic or racial minorities would be substantially overrepresented in that group, wouldn't they?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
But like I mentioned, we do not get racial information on most of the, or all of the samples that we receive, but logic tells me, yes, that's probably the case.
Well, for example, would you dispute that the African-American population in California is about 7%?
That's approximately what I've heard. I don't have those statistics with me.
But yet, for arrest statistics and arrest data, they account for from 30 to 35% of arrests, don't they?
The same thing, I'd have to accept your data on that, but I believe it's in that area.
All right. So minorities are much more likely to appear in the group of persons that you are testing for blood or bodily substances than they appear in the population as a whole.
That's correct.
So the frequency data that you come up with may not be replicated if we were looking at the frequency in the population as a whole.
That's true.
Now, tell us a little bit about your laboratory. How many serologists do you have employed in your laboratory?
Well, first off, all of our professional staff are criminalists. They are not necessarily hired as serologists or toxicologists or narcotics chemists. Within the serology unit right now, I have 6 people working.
Now, do all 6 of these people work in the same laboratory?
Same physical location, yes.
All right, in one room?
Yes.
All right. And all of your tests are performed in that one room?
Yes, that's correct.
Does your laboratory follow the FBI guidelines with respect to controls for contamination?
I would have to see exactly what they are. We do have a number of controls regarding contamination in place.
All right. Controls for contamination are pretty important in a laboratory doing the sensitive kind of testing that you do, are they not?
Definitely.
And occasionally there have been problems in laboratories doing this sort of testing with respect to what are called blooms of contamination.
I'm not sure what you mean by blooms of contamination.
That's not a term you've heard before?
Not in relation to the type of testing I performed here, no.
Have you heard that with respect to DNA testing?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, you do DNA testing in your laboratory, don't you?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Your Honor, we would offer to show that the contamination with respect to DNA testing could affect the accuracy of results with respect to other forms of testing of blood and bodily substances as well.
Well, Mr. Ullman, there's been no evidence presented, and in fact, the prosecutor was specifically asked whether they were going to be presenting DNA evidence in this proceeding, and the answer was no, and therefore I don't think that's relevant at this time.
I'm not proposing to offer DNA testing results. What I am proposing to explore is whether there has been a problem of contamination in the laboratory in which Mr. Matheson is employed.
Your Honor, the witness has already indicated that the type of contamination that that Mr. Ullman is referring to does not occur in the testing that he has conducted in this case.
As your question relates to DNA testing contamination, the objection is sustained.
All right. Let me ask you more broadly. Have there been any problems of any sort of contamination in your laboratory?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
To my knowledge, we have not had a problem with contamination within our laboratory.
Have there been documented examples of contamination in your laboratory?
Not to my knowledge.
And do you do a regular regimen of testing to see whether you have any problems of contamination in your laboratory?
Well, every one of our tests has built-in controls that would indicate whether or not there is a contamination or any other form of quality control problem.
All right. And do you regularly do proficiency testing of your results?
Yes, we do.
And do you have an error rate compiled for your laboratory?
Of the proficiency tests, both external and internal, that we have performed, there have not been any errors.
What kind of external testing do you have of your proficiency?
We subscribe to two different services. The one that has been around the longest, that we've used the most, is from a company called CTS, or Collaborative Testing Service.
And do they use blind testing?
No, they do not.
So you have never utilized any blind testing of your proficiency by external sources?
I think I need to clarify how you're using the term blind. We receive the items. We know that they are proficiency test samples. We do not know the results prior to our completion of the test and submission to them. But we do know they are proficiency test samples.
So there is no routine process whereby you test samples without knowing that they are part of a proficiency test.
That's correct.
Now, all of the tests that you described today that you did on the 3 blood samples and the blood stain are exclusionary tests. Is that correct?
If you mean by that, yes, we attempt to exclude somebody.
None of these tests can tell you specifically that a particular blood stain was left by a particular person.
That's correct. There's nothing here that would individualize a stain to any one particular person.
So any attempt to analogize this to fingerprints or precise identification of a person would be inaccurate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, the tests that you performed produce some sort of a product or result that other people can look at and interpret besides yourself?
In the case of the electrophoresis test, yes, we photographed the results.
You photograph the plate on which the test is performed?
That's correct.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes, we did.
All right. But there is nothing preserved with respect to the ABO typing?
No.
So no other person could interpret the results that you received from that?
Well, there is my raw data. In other words, the readings that I had as I was performing the test itself. Beyond that, no. All that's left is some additional sample that could be tested by somebody else if need be.
Okay. Now, normally, the ABO testing, for example, is going to be more accurate if you are testing whole blood samples, is it not?
I don't know if it'd be more accurate. Once we supply an answer, the answer, in my opinion, is accurate. The whole blood samples tend to be easier to analyze than a stain.
All right. And would that also be true with respect to the other tests that you performed here, the Group 1 and the PGM subtype?
No, not necessarily. With those tests, we take them basically to the same point where we're drawing down a part of the liquid sample to create a stain, and then we test the stain.
Is there any relationship between the age of a blood stain and how successful these tests are?
Yes, there is.
And what is that relationship?
Well, as a stain gets older, the likelihood of getting conclusive results becomes less and less. The factors that we're looking at are biological in nature, and unless they are stored in a proper condition, will eventually rot and be untestable.
At what point, for example, would you be unable to successfully conduct a PGM subtype test?
Like I said, it varies depending on the conditions. I have not been able to detect PGM on a stain that was picked up out at a scene as short as a week later. In that particular case, the stain was subjected to direct sunlight on the pavement for in excess of 24 hours, I believe. And I have also, on the converse side of that, successfully gotten PGM on stains that were 5 to 6 months old, but had been collected fairly quickly and then stored frozen.
So the promptness with which the samples are collected and how they are stored can have a significant impact on these tests. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you were not able to get conclusive results with respect to item 49 on all of the tests that you conducted, were you?
That's correct.
All right. Could you explain which of the tests you conducted gave you inconclusive results?
I'm going to refer to my report, copy of my report. Okay, in relation to item number 49, I got no activity for the GLOW test or the GLOW enzyme.
The GLOW was part of the Group 1 test that you did?
Yes, that's correct.
What would account for that you would not get any results on the GLOW on the Group 1 test?
The most likely answer is that some degradation of the sample had occurred. The GLOW or GLO enzyme degrades very rapidly, and we probably get less or fewer conclusive results from that one enzyme than from any of the others.
Does the fact that you get inconclusive results on the Group 1 test in any way raise doubts as to the results you get on the PGM subtype test?
You mean as far as, I'm assuming at this point you'd be talking about the PGM result that is derived during the course of the Group 1 testing. And inconclusive merely means that there's some question about that particular reading. And if it was a straight inconclusive or a no activity, then I would be concerned a little bit about the result that was obtained on the subtype test. I would like to have a confirmation. In this particular case, item number 49 exhibited a 2 plus 2 minus. I would expect the PGM to be a 2. They would correlate there.
Now, the PGM test is the same test that you rely on for the GLOW enzyme, isn't it?
Well, it's all part of the same run on the same electrophoresis plate. It's not necessarily the same test. It just so happens you can develop different portions of the same gel for different enzymes.
Now, you make one assumption in the test that you conduct on item 49, and that is that the substance you are testing emanated or came from one individual, don't you?
I don't assume that while doing the test, no. I run my analysis. I do assume that when I'm doing the frequency calculations, that's correct. But as far as the rest of the testing goes, it doesn't matter whether it's a mixture or not. The results are obtained and they're recorded.
Are you saying you would get the same results that you're reporting here, even if the stain that was being tested was a mixture that came from two different individuals?
Well, this particular stain gave the results that were obtained. If there's more than one individual present in that, it would still give the exact same results because that's what was obtained on the sample. If you are saying that this sample was mixed with the blood of another individual that had different genetic marker types and are exhibited here, then the results would have reflected that.
Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Assume that we had an assailant with type O blood who was injured in the course of the commission of a crime. And on that assailant's hands were blood of the victim, which is type A. If those two bloods were mixed and the drop that you are testing was some mixture of those two blood types, what result would you get for your ABO test?
As far as the example that you gave, the results would be the same here. It would be indicative of a type A.
All right. So you wouldn't know that there was a type O assailant because you're assuming that this all came from one person.
Well, back to the other question, I'm not assuming that it did come from one person. However, the results that you obtained during the testing of a blood stain in the ABO blood typing system, if it's strictly from a type A person, you could have the presence of the A antigen or a combination of A and H, which ultimately indicates a type A. A type O person has this H antigen present in their system. So if you have a mixture of blood from an A person and from an O person, you'd also see the A and H, and ultimately would be indicative of a type A.
So you get the same result.
That's correct.
So if the scenario I presented involved an assailant with type O blood and 2 plus 2 minus PGM mixed with the blood of a victim who had a type A blood and a 1 plus PGM subtype, would you get the same result you have here?
No, given the scenario you just described, in the PGM subtype system, I would expect to see a 1 plus 2 plus 2 minus.
Right. Now, is there any quantitative variation in that mixture in which you would not see the 1+ PGM subtype?
Sure, at some point, if the mixture of blood that was the type A PGM subtype 1+ got down low enough so that the 1+ was no longer detectable, then yeah, theoretically that could happen.
What kind of mixture would that be? 20-to-1?
I have no idea.
No idea?
No.
So if there were a possibility of mixture, that would substantially affect the calculation of frequency of occurrence that you presented here today, wouldn't it?
If it was required to calculate a frequency, then we would also have to include in that frequency the population of type O individuals.
All right, well, what difference would that make if we included both O and A in the ABO results and then multiplied it by the frequency you're using for PGM subtype?
Well, if you give me a moment, I'll calculate that for you.
Thank you.
The way I figure it, rather than having a 0.43% of the population approximately, it would work out to approximately 1%.
All right, so instead of 1 in 200, it would be 1 in 100.
That's correct.
When you talk about that kind of frequency in a population the size of Los Angeles, for example, where we have 8 million people, you're saying that there are something on the order of 40,000 to 80,000 other people whose blood would produce the identical genetic markers that you have identified in item 49. Is that correct?
Approximately, that's correct, yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. Clark?
Yes. Mr. Matheson, is there anything in the stain that we have marked as item number 49 that indicates to you that it is indeed a mixture of blood from two people?
Well, I would not necessarily know that. Like I mentioned earlier, the results would be the same, but there's nothing specific to indicate a mixture or whether it's not a mixture.
If indeed item number 49 came from two individuals, then they would both have to have a PGM subtype of 2+, 2-, somewhere in there?
You'd have to have at least one of the factors. If it's, approximately equal mix, like I mentioned earlier in the example that was given, if it was a different subtype, I would expect to see that other type show up. So if we did in fact have a mixture, the additional blood would have to be either a 2+, 2-, or a 2+, or a 2-.
And in fact, at least none of the other two victims have that.
That's correct.
And then that other person would also have to be a type 1 for ESD.
That's correct.
And an O or an A as to the ABO system.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you familiar with the term known as titering?
Yes.
Would you be able to, if asked, titer the stain known as item number 49 with respect to ESD or PGM subtype to determine the quantities with respect to being able to either rule out or limit the possibility of it being the blood of two different people?
I don't believe that would be appropriate testing to determine something like that. I'm not sure you could determine something like that.
Is there any testing you're aware of that could narrow down that could eliminate completely the possibility of that being two people?
Not to my knowledge, no.
But there was no independent evidence that you were able to find that determined that, in fact, that was indeed the blood of two people?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Ullman, anything else?
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Matheson, if we had a mixture that included PGM subtype 2+2- plus some other subtype, at some point in terms of the ratio of the mixture, the other subtype would be masked or would not appear in your results. Isn't that correct?
Is this similar to what we were talking about before, if there was a completely foreign type besides the 2+2-?
Right.
That's correct. If you get to a point where the other blood was diluted to the point where it didn't show up, then you wouldn't see it.
But you would still see the A result on the ABO test.
I suppose at some point it's possible where you'd still see the A and not the subtype.
Thank you. Nothing. Excuse me. 1 minute. Do you make some sort of calculation of how much of the sample you are consuming in the course of the tests that you're running?
Are you asking me, can I tell you how much I used?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Refer to my analysis notes. I consumed a portion of one of the swatches that was available to me that was approximately 6 millimeters by 3, approximation. That left 2 swatches plus a portion of that one remaining that I worked on.
So each of these tests that you perform consumes a certain proportion of the sample that you have available to test.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. One other question.
All right.
With respect to the sample of the item number 17, the blood of O.J. Simpson, did you similarly inventory how much of that sample you consumed?
The proportion that would be consumed would have been a stain of consisting significantly less of than 1 drop out of the vial, which when I received it had about 2 milliliters of blood in it. So it would have been a insignificant.
Either at the margins or in the tissue spaces along the wound path.
Doctor,
I might say, incidentally, when I describe wounds or forensic pathologists describe wounds, we may say that we may describe injuries and specify where injuries appear to be post-mortem. I mean, that's characteristic. If we find a wound that appears to be inflicted post-mortem, we would specifically state that. And contrary to that, when we see vital activity, we generally describe bleeding in the wound or in the wound path or in the tissue spaces along the wound to substantiate that they occurred during life.
Dr. Golden, with regard to the figure in the lower left-hand portion of the diagram marked as Peoples 25 for identification, does that figure indicate some sort of wound or trauma to the right side of Nicole Brown Simpson's head?
If we're referring to the red marking here, yes.
And what did you find during the course of your autopsy that indicated such a wound or trauma?
Well, I'm referring to my report to refresh memory, but there was a bruise on the right side of the scalp, 4 inches directly above the ear canal. And after a shaving of the scalp, it was 1 by 1 inch. It was a fresh bruise. It was red-violet in color. No other injury was apparent, meaning no abrasion or laceration. And this bruise, on subsequent examination, disclosed bruising beneath the scalp. Fresh bruising beneath the scalp.
Would that indicate to you, sir, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, this was an antemortem wound. It was associated with a deep scalp bruise.
Inflicted, consequently, while Nicole Brown Simpson was still alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And inferentially, before she received the gaping incised wound across the neck. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram that I would like to have marked. It pertains to the autopsy of Nicole Brown Simpson. It reflects the 3 wounds to the scalp. May this be People's 26 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during the course of your autopsy upon the body of Nicole Brown Simpson, did you observe wounds or trauma to the scalp of Nicole?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us what you observed, sir.
There was a cutting wound on the back of the scalp, left side. Which, and I'm referring to my report, particularly the addendum report on Nicole Brown Simpson. It's a 1 1/4 inch length, diagonally oriented cutting wound, tapered above, and this doesn't reflect it as well. The diagram doesn't reflect the actual appearance as the photograph would, but it's a 1 1/4 inch long cutting wound. It was longer than deep. It went into the scalp for approximately 3/8 to 1/2 inch and did no further damage to the skull.
This was not a fatal wound, I take it?
No.
Was it an antemortem wound, that is one that was inflicted before Nicole Brown Simpson died?
Yes, it was. This wound was associated with fresh scalp hemorrhage. In other words, bleeding in the deep scalp tissues.
Now, Dr. Golden, there were 2 other wounds that you observed with regard to Nicole Brown Simpson's scalp. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a cutting wound or stab wound superficially right in the posterior parietal occipital, in other words, lower down here on the right side of the lower scalp. This was a 1/2 inch in length superficial wound, only going in, again, 3/8 to 1/2 inch, a non-fatal wound.
Was it also?
There was a small amount of hemorrhage associated. Again, that occurred before death. It was an antemortem injury.
Okay, thank you, doctor. And just for purposes of the record, you were indicating a wound roughly in the center of the head, midway between the ears on People's 26 for identification.
Yes.
Doctor, there was a 3rd wound. Would you briefly describe that wound for us and indicate whether or not it was antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
That was an antemortem cutting wound, 3/16 of an inch in length, involving the skin only, with a small amount of deep scalp hemorrhage. Again, it's antemortem. It was a superficial cutting wound of the scalp.
And you're indicating on the diagram, People's 26 for identification, a wound closest to the left ear as depicted on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy as performed upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you notice any injuries to her hands?
Yes.
Tell us about that, sir.
Well, referring to my notes, my autopsy notes and protocol to refresh my memory, on the index finger on the right index finger, there was a 5/8 inch long cut of the skin adjacent to the distal knuckle. Involved the skin only, and it had was a tangential cut, which would indicate that it was shelved. In other words, it didn't go in straight. It was an oblique cut, which would indicate a shelving or a tangential cut.
And so what is the distal knuckle?
The one closest to the fingertip. Proximal, distal. Proximal is closer to the. Proximal would be closer to the hand, and distal would be closer to the fingertip.
I see. Would you briefly describe the other wounds to Nicole Brown Simpson's hands that you observed?
Few minor injuries. Punctate abrasion on the ring finger of the right hand. On the left hand, there was a punctate abrasion, base of the right ring finger. And finally, there was a 1/2 inch superficial skin cut on the top of the left hand.
Dr. Golden, are you familiar with the term defense wounds?
Yes.
What are defense wounds, sir?
Defense wounds are injuries on the upper extremities, either the arms or the hands, which would occur when the victim raises the extremities to protect the body or to ward off or grab the instrument, or to ward off or fend off the blow by an assailant.
Sir, in your opinion, were any of the wounds to Nicole Brown Simpson's hands compatible with defense wounds?
Yes.
And why is that, sir?
The cut on the right index finger is in a characteristic location for a defense wound on the palm or volar surface of the finger, which could indicate an attempt to fend off the weapon or to grab the weapon, and the superficial cutting wound on the top of the hand that I described could also be construed as a defense wound. It's a superficial cut, but could also indicate a defensive motion to attempt to ward off the I don't want to say blow, to ward off the weapon that was inflicting the injuries.
Dr. Golden, at the conclusion of the autopsy that you performed upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you form an opinion as to the cause of her death?
Yes.
What was your opinion, sir?
She died as a result of the sharp force injuries, which includes the cutting wound and the stab wound. So they're grouped as sharp force injuries.
And that would include the wounds most specifically depicted and as characterized by your testimony in People's 25 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Golden, later in the morning on June 14th, 1994, You performed an autopsy upon the body of an individual identified to you as Ronald Goldman, is that correct?
Yes.
And prior to performing the autopsy procedures, did you examine the body and determine that it was clothed?
Yes.
And would you describe how Mr. Goldman's body was clothed when you first observed it?
Okay, I'll also refer to my autopsy protocol, but he was wearing a long sleeve type of shirt or sweater that was extensively bloodstained and moist at the time that I examined it. And he was also wearing a pair of bloodstained Levi jeans and 2 canvas type boots and 2 sweat socks.
Sir, with regard to the shirt, did you examine it for any evidence of cuts or slits or tears?
Yes, I did.
What did you find?
On the front or lower right side, there was a 1.5 inch long slit-like tear. Lower right sleeve, a 1 inch slit-like tear. On the back, lower side of the back, there is a 1/2 inch slit-like tear.
And sir, with regard to Mr. Goldman's jeans, did you find any evidence of a slit, tear, or cut in that item of clothes?
Yes, on the jeans, on the outside of the left hip region, there was a 1.5 inch long slit.
And Dr. Goldman, as part of your autopsy procedure, was the clothing removed from Mr. Goldman's body and preserved?
Yes.
After the clothing was removed, Dr. Goldman, did you determine the length of Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes.
And what was that, sir?
69 inches or 5 feet 9 inches.
And Dr. Goldman, did you also determine the weight of Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes, 171 pounds.
Doctor, did you observe injury to the neck area of Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
And starting with the front of the neck, did you observe any evidence of injury to the front of the neck?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here a diagram pertaining to Ronald Goldman's autopsy. It reflects wounds to the front of the neck as well as to the right side of the face and as to the left side of the neck. May that be Peoples 27 for identification?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Goldman, Peoples 27 for identification is a diagram that you prepared in the course of the autopsy you performed upon Ronald Goldman's body. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And during the course of that autopsy, did you observe what appeared to be 2 parallel incised wounds on the front of Mr. Goldman's neck?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe those in more detail for us, sir, and make reference to the diagram Peoples 27 for identification as you do so?
Okay, I'll also use the autopsy report and the addendum report. Basically, at the there was a transverse superficial cutting wound at the level of the superior border of the larynx or voice box, 3 inches in length, and it on the left side it went within 1/2 inch of the of another injury of the left side of the neck to be described later, and it went transversely across the front of the neck to the right side to the right anterior side of the neck.
How deep was that particular wound, Dr. Goldman?
It was deeper on the left, where it went down through the skin and dermis to the fascia, the connective tissue beneath the dermis and overlying the muscle. It became more superficial on the right.
Was that a deep wound?
I've already described it, Steph. It went down to the fascia on the left and tapered to the skin on the right. It was not a fatal wound.
And what are the fascia?
Fascia is the connective tissue, the flat sheets of connective tissue beneath in the tissue planes. Here would be the covering, the superficial fascia overlying the muscles of the neck.
And doctor, this particular incised wound was not fatal in and of itself. Is that correct?
No, it was not.
Was it inflicted ante-mortem, that is, before fatal wounds were inflicted upon Mr. Goldman?
Yeah.
Again, just for the sake of the record, and I hate to bring this up, from where I'm sitting, it appears that the doctor from time to time at least refreshes his memory.
I think many times he has told us, it looks like you are looking at your report again to answer the question.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there was a small amount of tissue hemorrhage associated with that wound.
And with regard to your indications to the diagram here, you were referring to the upper leftmost figure on People's 27 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, did you also observe a second incised wound below the larynx and parallel to the one you've just described?
Yes.
Describe that for us, please.
That was below the first wound, referring to my notes. It was horizontally oriented. It was parallel to the first wound, 6 inches in length, starting on the left side of the neck. It was superficial, excuse me, involving the skin only, and it went around to the right side of the neck.
Did it angulate upwards?
It went to the right side of the neck, and although it's not shown here, it then angulated upward towards another wound on the right side of the neck to be described below.
Was this wound fatal in and of itself?
So this wound was superficial, and I've indicated it involves the skin. It involves the skin only. It was a superficial cutting wound.
And how would you characterize this wound in terms of being antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
I believe it to be antemortem, inasmuch as there was a small amount of visible dermal, meaning skin hemorrhage, when I first saw it.
Now, doctor, referring to the lower right-hand figure on People's 27 for identification, does that particular figure depict some evidence of injury to the left side of Mr. Goldman's neck and head that you observed during the course of your autopsy?
Yes, it does.
Now, using your pointer, sir, and taking the lowermost wound, would you describe what you found with regard to that wound when you conducted your autopsy upon Mr. Goldman's body?
Well, there was a large gaping sharp force injury on the left side of the neck, 3 inches in length, which I'm pointing to right here.
Indicating the lowermost apparent sharp force wound in red on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, would you tell us something about the wound path of that particular wound?
Okay. And of course, I'm refreshing my memory. It was on the left side of the neck, began at the level of the mid-larynx, cut through the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it went through the skin and the muscle with bleeding along the path, and basically it severed the left internal jugular vein. There was extensive bleeding in the adjacent tissue. And I determined that to be the pathway of that wound.
Did that wound transect or sever any major blood vessel?
Yes, as I stated, it transected the left internal jugular vein.
Now, there was a second wound to the left side of Mr. Goldman's head, is that correct?
Yes.
Describe that for us, please, in brief.
The second wound was above it, behind the left ear. It was a gaping wound, 2 inches in length. The lower borders were irregular or ragged, and as I mentioned, it was 2 inches in length. Along the tissue planes, it appeared to be separated from the lower one by an approximate distance of 4 inches. So those two wounds shared common areas of injury.
Are you saying that the two wound paths intersected with regard to those two wounds?
Yes, they met. They met deep along the tissue planes. So basically, you say they communicated or they shared common areas of injury.
Taking those two wounds together, doctor, are they fatal wounds? Either one or both or together? Also taking into consideration that the jugular vein on that side was severed?
Well, one or either or together, it's a fatal injury because of the severing of the left internal jugular vein.
And doctor, with regard to those two wounds, were they antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
No, as I've described, there was extensive hemorrhage along the wound path and in the tissue spaces.
Now, doctor, I realize that there are more lesser wounds that were not indicated on your diagram, but I would like to move ahead now to the lower left-hand figure on people's 27 for identification. And, sir, you observed during the course of your autopsy 5 wounds to the right side of Mr. Goldman's face. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it appears that we have 4 of those 5 wounds marked in red on that lower left-hand figure on people's 27 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, would you, in brief, describe those wounds for us, sir?
Okay, and referring to my notes, these were superficial cuts, varying in orientation, involving the skin of the right cheek, and they varied from approximately 1/2 to 1 inch in maximal length.
And these 5 wounds, sir, were non-fatal. Is that correct? In and of themselves?
No, correction. Actually, yes. I said 1/2 to 1. It's referring to my protocol. They were small cuts. They varied from 1/4 inch in length to 5/8 of an inch in length. These superficial cuts on the right side of the cheek.
All to the right side of the cheek, is that correct?
Yes.
And were all of those antemortem wounds, as far as you can determine?
Yes, they were.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, you observed injury to the right side of Mr. Goldman's neck, did you not?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram pertaining to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. It depicts wounds to the right side of the neck. May that be People's next in order 28.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Golden, with regard to the lower left-hand figure depicted on People's 28 for identification,
Yes.
you observed some wounds in that area of Mr. Goldman's body. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe those wounds for us, please?
Right, and referring to the report in the addendum, on the right side of the neck, 3 inches below the external auditory canal, there was a stab wound, 5/8 of an inch in length, and one end was pointed, the other end was Y-shaped or forked. And basically, the wound path was through the skin, subcutaneous tissue, did not strike a major artery or vein. And this wound connected or shared common area of injury with another wound on the right side of the neck above it, which was below and behind the right ear, behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And that was a 2-inch long wound with a 1-inch long superficial cut of the skin above it. And as you indicate here, the wound that I've just described, the deeper wound, intersected the superficial cut of the front of the neck, which we described earlier, which went around to the right side of an angle upward and intersected that wound. So that's why it has that peculiar configuration there.
And sir, when you're referring to that superficial incised wound, that was on a previous diagram, what appeared to be a superficial incised cut, which moved across above the larynx and then intersected with this wound as depicted on People's 28. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, Dr. Golden, with regard to these wounds that you just described in your testimony, were these wounds fatal in and of themselves?
All that I've described on the right side of the neck were not fatal, as I've described earlier. No major artery or vein was cut or incised, and that includes the jugular and the common carotid artery.
Dr. Golden, although not depicted on this particular diagram, did you observe abrasions to the right side of Mr. Goldman's face?
Yes.
And in brief, describe what you observed with regard to the pattern of abrasions that you observed.
Well, these are not depicted, so I'll have to refer to my notes, particularly on the addendum. There are multiple abrasions or scrapes on the right side of the face, extending from the basically extending from the temporal region down to the right cheek, and from the going as far forward as the lower eyelid and back to the front of the ear. Basically, the area covered was 4.5 by 2.5 inches, and they were linear, some diagonally oriented, some vertically. The area that they covered, namely the abrasions, also circumscribed the area of the superficial cutting wounds of the right cheek that I described earlier.
Those are the 5 cutting wounds you testified to?
Yes. So I had 2 things visible there: the multiple abrasions on the cheek, and then the circumscribed area which contain the cutting wounds, the superficial cutting wounds.
And sir, with reference to the diagram People's 28 for identification, you're indicating an area on the figure in the lower left-hand side, is that correct?
Yes?
Now, with regard to those abrasions, would you characterize those abrasions as antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
I would not characterize them as postmortem. They appear to be perimortem based on their color.
And again, perimortem meaning?
At about the time of death, which could be shortly before, at the time of, or shortly thereafter.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, you observed a number of various small incised wounds to the right and left ears of Mr. Goldman, is that correct?
Yes.
And did you also observe injuries to the scalp of Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram pertaining to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. May that be People's 29 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, with reference to People's 29 for identification, does that diagram, particularly the figure in the lower right-hand corner, depict the approximate locations of scalp wounds you observed on Mr. Goldman's head during the course of your autopsy?
Yes, it does.
Were each of those wounds non-fatal?
Yes, that's correct.
And did they all appear to be antemortem in nature?
Yes, they did.
And with regard to the dimensions of the wounds, no, I'll withdraw that. Now, Dr. Golden, during the course of your autopsy, you also observed what appeared to be stab wounds to the torso of Mr. Goldman's body. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here another diagram depicting apparent stab wounds to the right side of the torso and the left thigh. May that be People's 30 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, with reference to People's 30 for identification and the figure which appears at the left-hand side of the diagram, are there depicted the approximate locations of 3 stab or cutting wounds that you observed on Mr. Goldman's body during the autopsy that you performed?
Yes.
And again, these wounds are numbered for reference purposes only and do not necessarily mean the order in which they were inflicted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Dr. Golden, starting with wound number 1, as indicated on People's 30 for identification, would you describe that wound for us, please?
That depicts a stab wound on the right side of the chest. Excuse me. Did you want a description of each wound, or just what they are?
I would like a description of each wound, starting with the wound that you have numbered as number 1.
All right. That was a stab wound on the right side of the chest, 5/8 of an inch in length, with a rounded or blunt end on the lower end, and this wound went into the chest through the right 7th rib into the chest cavity. There was approximately 100-200 ml of blood in the chest cavity, and further dissection disclosed that the wound perforated the right lung and continued forward and terminated, or the wound path terminated on the front of the rib cage, where I found a 3/4 inch cut on the the posterior aspect or back of the right fourth rib. So after estimating the total length of the wound path was 4 inches.
Now, doctor, when you say ml, you're referring to milliliters, are you not?
Yes.
Was the length of this particular wound approximately 5/8 of an inch?
The measurement on the skin was 5/8 of an inch, yeah.
And in your opinion, sir, was this wound consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Yes, this one had the configuration of a single-edged blade. It had the wound had a blunt or squared off end and a pointed or tapered end.
Was this a fatal wound, doctor?
This wound perforated the lung and caused hemorrhage into the right chest cavity, and is considered a fatal wound. It should also be noted there was another stab wound also into the right side of the chest, which also injured the lung.
We're going to talk about that second stab wound in just a second, doctor. It's just one more question with regard to stab wound number 1. Was that an antemortem wound, in your opinion?
Yes, it was.
Now, doctor, with reference to the stab wound that you have numbered as stab wound number 2 on the right side of Mr. Goldman's body, would you describe that wound for us, please?
That was on the right side of the chest. Actually close to stab wound number 1. And this wound measured 1.5 inches in length on the skin, diagonally oriented. This also had the characteristic of a dull or blunt end and a pointed or a tapered end, which again is consistent with a single-edged blade. And this wound also penetrated the chest through the rib cage, and this wound path was close to the wound path of stab wound number 1, with bleeding along the wound path, and it also went through the lower part of the right lung, creating a perforating injury. And again, there was hemorrhage along the wound path and the blood in the pleural cavity.
Indicating that this was a wound inflicted while Mr. Goldman was alive, isn't that right?
Yes.
Was this wound fatal?
Yes, because of the perforation of the lung and the associated hemothorax.
Doctor, there's a third wound that is depicted on the figure, the left-hand side of people's 30 for identification. That was a stab wound to the right flank, was it not?
Yes.
And that had a length of approximately 3/8 inches and a depth of penetration only into the skin and underlying tissue, is that correct?
Yes, that was a superficial wound. It did not penetrate the chest or abdomen.
Was it an antemortem wound, in your opinion?
Yes.
Doctor, with regard to the figure at the right side of the diagram marked People's 30 for identification, there appears to be a wound to the left thigh indicated on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you detect and observe such a wound upon the body of Ronald Goldman when you performed the autopsy?
Yes.
And would you describe that wound, please?
This was a stab wound of the lateral outside aspect of the left thigh, 2 1/8 inches in length, and there was a blunt or dull end seam, 1/32 of an inch, and the wound path was through the skin into the muscle of the of the thigh with bleeding along the wound path. The depth of penetration was approximately 3-3.5 inches.
Meaning 3 to 3.5 inches?
Yes.
And from your testimony, sir, I would infer that this was a wound that you would characterize as antemortem. Is that correct?
Yes, there was bleeding along the wound path and the tissue spaces, yes.
With regard to what you observed in connection with this particular wound, would you characterize this wound as one consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Now, this wound did have the characteristic rounded or dull end that would be characteristic of a single-edged blade. Yes, it would.
Doctor, during the course of the autopsy involving Mr. Goldman's body, you detected a wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman, did you not?
Yes.
And, Your Honor, I have here one last diagram depicting the described wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman. May this be 31 for identification?
Yes.
Doctor, with reference to the wound as depicted in the rightmost figure on this diagram of People's 31 for identification, would you describe that wound for us, please?
Okay, and I'm referring to my report to refresh my my recollection. It was a stab wound of the left flank below the rib cage, and it was 3/4 of an inch in length. This wound did not have a blunt or squared off end. It was, one end was pointed or tapered, the opposite end was forked or split. And then going through this wound penetrated into the body wall and passed through the muscle, the iliopsoas muscle, with bleeding along the way, and then going from back to front, the wound path ended in the abdominal aorta, where two perforating stab wounds were evident. So the wound terminated in the abdominal aorta with two perforating wounds.
In other words, the abdominal aorta was perforated, is that correct?
Yes.
What was the apparent depth of the wound?
Measured from the outside of the body wall to the termination in the aorta was approximately 5.5 inches.
Was this wound fatal in and of itself?
Yes, this perforated the aorta. There was hemorrhage along the wound path, and there was bleeding inside the body cavity, the peritoneal cavity.
Doctor, not depicted on any diagram identified thus far, was there a stab wound to the upper right chest over the right clavicle? Do you recall that one?
Yes, yes. It's not on this diagram. It's in my report.
And that was a superficial wound?
This is a superficially oriented wound, 1/2 inch in length, involving the skin and subcutaneous tissue. Again, it was split or forked on one end, pointed or tapered on the other end, with a small amount of hemorrhage. Again, cannot tell from this wound whether it was caused by a single or double-edged blade.
You were able to determine, were you not, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, there was a small amount of fresh bleeding associated, so it was an antemortem wound.
Dr. Golden, earlier in your testimony today, you have described for us what are known as defense wounds. Did you see any indicia of defense wounds on Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes.
In general, would you describe what you observed in that regard?
He had cutting wounds on the right hand and on the left hand. And specifically, there were cutting wounds on the palm of the right hand, at the base of the index finger, palmar surface of the right hand, at the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the right hand, near the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the left hand, at the web of the thumb, and on the addendum report, specifically on the palmar surface of the left hand, there was a superficial cutting wound. So I believe that characterizes the main sharp force or cutting injuries on his hands.
I have here two photographs. People's 29 for identification, with the court's permission, depicts the
I'm sorry, People's 29? We're up to
32.
31.
Yes. And that the photograph bears a coroner's tag and appears to depict the right palm of the decedent. And then People's 33 for identification, Your Honor, similar photograph depicting what appears to be the left palm of the decedent, Ronald Goldman. It too also bears a coroner's evidence tag, which corresponds to the case number assigned to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. May these be so marked by identification?
Yes.
Dr. Goldman, I'm going to hand you first People's 32 for identification and ask that you observe that in discrete fashion. Sir, does that photograph depict the sharper incised wounds that you've described in your testimony as defense wounds to the right palm of Mr. Goldman's hand?
Yes.
Was that a photo taken during Mr. Goldman's autopsy?
Yes.
With regard to People's 33 for identification, would you tell us what that depicts, sir? That is the photograph that is now face down on the witness stand before you. What does that photograph depict, sir?
That is the left hand of the decedent, palmar surface.
Does that photograph truly and accurately depict the defense wounds to the left palm of Mr. Goldman's hands that you've described thus far in your testimony?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, in addition to the wounds depicted in People's 32 and 33 for identification, did you observe what might be characterized as other defense wounds to the back of Mr. Goldman's hands as well as to his forearms?
Yes.
And in general and in brief, how would you characterize those wounds?
Basically, there are multiple abrasions involving the forearm, including the outer or lateral aspect of the forearm where there are multiple abrasions. That means scratches. Some were not scratches. They were irregular in configuration. On the top of the hand, there were fresh bruises, abrasions on the knuckles, and I went into detail on which fingers and which knuckles there are abrasions, bruises on the various knuckles and fingers of the right hand. On the top or dorsal surface of the left hand, there were multiple red-brown abrasions involving the knuckles of the index finger, and then there were also multiple irregularly configured abrasions on the knuckle of the middle finger. there was also a fresh bruise, about 1 1/4 by 1 1/2 inches on the top of the left hand, adjacent to the wrist, and fresh bruises on the ulnar surface of the left wrist, which means on the, I guess you'd say, the inner surface of the left wrist, and on the addendum report, there were a few additional abrasions on the fingers, the fingers of the left hand, middle finger, left hand, fifth finger, and on the distal portion of the left thumb. So basically, there were a number of abrasions and bruises, many on the top or knuckles of the fingers and on the top of the hand.
All compatible with defense wounds, in your opinion?
Well, yes, or arising during a struggle.
Dr. Golden, at the conclusion of your autopsy, did you form an opinion as to the cause of Ronald Goldman's death?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
He died as a result of the multiple sharp injuries, which included the cutting wound of the left side of the neck, which severed or transected the left internal jugular vein, and the 2 stab wounds of the right side of the chest, which perforated the thorax and right lung, and the stab wound of the left side of the abdomen, which perforated the abdominal aorta.
A few more questions, sir, if I may.
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during each of these autopsies, were the investigating officers from the Los Angeles Police Department present?
Yes.
And by that I mean specifically, were Detectives Phil Van Adder and Tom Lang present during each of the autopsies?
Yes.
Sir, with regard to the autopsy performed on Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you take a blood sample for purposes of serological study?
Yes.
And was that particular blood sample placed in a test tube bearing Nicole Brown Simpson's name and the applicable coroner's case number?
Yes.
Was the same procedure followed with regard to the taking of a blood sample from Ronald Goldman's body?
Yes.
And were those blood samples later delivered into the custody of Detective Van Adder?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, on June the 15th, 1994, were you visited at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office by Detective Phil Van Adder?
Yes.
On that date, sir, did Detective Van Adder show you a knife?
Yes.
Describe what you recall about the knife that was shown to you by Detective Van Adder.
It was a folding knife with a blade approximately 6 inches long.
And describe what happened when Detective Van Adder showed you that knife.
Well, he wanted to know if that knife was consistent or compatible with the wounds that I saw inflicted on either individual, and whether it was compatible with some of the wounds inflicted on either individual.
And did you provide Detective Van Adder with an answer?
I said it could. Yes, I did.
And what was your answer?
I said it could have been the weapon. Yes, and inflicted some of the wounds.
You examined the knife. Is that correct?
Cursorily, yes. I measured the length and the width of the blade.
Now, is your opinion that a knife such as that could have inflicted the wounds received by Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman definitive, or would you have liked to have done something more with regard to examination of the knife to determine more precisely?
It was not definitive. I'd like to do a lot more.
Like what?
Well, make detailed measurements of the blade, correlating each wound that I described, specifically each stab wound that I described in my protocol with measurements of the blade of the instrument.
To date, sir, have you had the opportunity to conduct such an examination?
No, I haven't.
So your opinion then is with regard to the knife displayed to you by Detective Van Ander that it could have inflicted the wounds upon Mr. Goldman's body and upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, but not necessarily so. Is that correct?
Not necessarily so. To be scientific, I would have to get my little white ruler out that I use for measuring the wounds on the body and do the same thing on the knife.
Okay. May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
No further questions.
It's about 5 minutes to 12. Which of you is going to cross-examine the witness? Okay. I think we'll break at this point. We'll start with your cross-examination at 1:30. I would like to see counsel briefly in chambers.
Order court is once again in session.
We're once again in the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. The people are represented. Dr. Golden's on the witness stand. I remind you, sir, that you remain under oath. Mr. Shapiro.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, I was presented this morning with a 3/4 page form that indicates curriculum vitae, and it's dated May 5th of '94. Is this your current resume?
Yes,
And is it up to date?
I believe so.
I notice in here that it indicates a space for current academic appointments, and it's blank. During your tenure, have you had any academic appointments?
No,
And it indicates in here current medical staff appointments, and it's blank. During your tenure, have you had any medical staff appointments?
no.
Then the next thing that's listed is the concise summary of your role in the forensic pathology program, and it lists 3 things: that you perform autopsies, courtroom testimony, and lecture. Does that cover the gamut of the summary of your role as a forensic pathologist?
Trying to think if there's anything I've omitted. Basically so, yes, unless there's some things I haven't recollected. It's basically I'm a deputy medical examiner and forensic pathologist. I don't have any medical school faculty appointments.
Because there was some talk before about you being a physician. Have you ever practiced medicine?
Yes.
Now, it indicates you're a lecturer. What type of lectures do you give, and to whom?
That would be intramural lectures at the Department of Coroner.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
That would be intramural or interdepartmental lectures at the Department of Coroner.
So you talk to your colleagues?
That would be, yes, yes.
And courtroom testimony, you told us, I believe, that you testified approximately 700 times?
Approximately, yes.
And how many of those 700 times have you been called as a witness for the prosecution?
Many times, hundreds of times.
How many of those times have you been called as a witness for the defense?
I don't have the tally. In civil cases, I could be called by either the plaintiff or the defendant, so I wouldn't know. I have testified in civil cases, but in those instances, I'm not sure whether it's been the plaintiff or the defendant in most of the criminal in most of the criminal cases, the prosecution calls me as a witness, but not invariably, because I won't say frequently, but occasionally the defense counsel wants us called as a witness rather than accepting a stipulation.
Have you testified in any other state as an expert witness other than California?
Not as a friend, no, I have not.
And have you testified in any other city, or any other county other than Los Angeles County as a forensic pathologist, as an expert?
Well, as the medical examiner, some of my cases have been in other counties. I'm sure about San Bernardino County. I have been in Santa Barbara County. I have been called as a witness in Santa Barbara County, but it pertains to a Department of Coroner case. But it was a civil case, and either the plaintiff or the defendant called me. But the reason I went there was not as a consultant, because the decedent came under our jurisdiction. But I did testify at a civil case in Santa Barbara County, criminal case in San Bernardino County, but I would be available in criminal cases in any county in California.
Now, also on your curriculum vitae, you have a title list, representative publications from the last 5 years. And you have included yourself as a co-author in 1989 of a 4-page magazine article dealing with pneumonia in infants. Is that the extent of your publications?
Yes.
Have you reviewed the general text in the field for determining time of death?
Excuse me, did you say text or texts?
Text.
I still don't. Singular.
Books.
Yes.
And what books have you relied upon in forming opinions as to the cause or as to the time of death?
I have read forensic pathology textbooks, and these would be the standard texts, Gradwell's Forensic Medicine, Spitz and Fisher's Medical Legal Investigation of Death, latest edition, Adelson, Pathology of Homicide, DeMayo's text on forensic pathology, and Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, and Knight's textbook on forensic pathology. And these are all standard references available to me at the Department of Coroner.
And in reviewing those sources, would you agree that the following factors are to be considered in determining time of death? First, rigor mortis.
Yes.
Second, libidity.
Yes.
Third, temperature change.
Yes.
Fourth, digestion in the stomach.
Yes.
And fifth, eye fluids.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to add to that list?
Eyewitness.
Eyewitness. Okay. That'll be 6. Anything else?
No, I think that covers it.
And would you say that one of the important roles of your job as a deputy medical examiner is to ascertain the time of death in a homicide?
I would say to give, to help determine a range of the time of death, yes.
And there are other people who you work with in forming those conclusions that are part of the coroner's office, is that correct?
Yes, that is.
And that would be a medical investigator
Yes.
and a deputy coroner?
Yes.
Would there be other members of the team that you would rely on for that type of information?
No, the deputy coroner, the coroner investigator would be our eyes and ears in this matter.
And those people have also filed reports that you've included as part of what you've called the autopsy report or autopsy protocol, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you reviewed their findings prior to testifying today.
Yes.
In reviewing their findings, regarding Nicole Simpson, were you informed that she was found and pronounced dead by a member of the Los Angeles Fire Department Engine 19 squad?
Okay. I guess I can't find the relevant page in my protocol here. Yes, okay. Yes, yes. LAFD Engine 19, pronounced by LAFD Engine 19.
And what was the time that the decedent, Miss Brown, was pronounced dead?
Objection, Your Honor, calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Your Honor, may I be heard on that?
All right.
Did you, first, I believe these are official records and part of the autopsy protocol, which he's indicated, and that if he has relied on these records in forming his opinion, he can testify to it. Second, hearsay is admissible at these proceedings.
Yes, Mr.
If I may be heard, Your Honor.
Yes.
First of all, the people have elicited no opinion with regard to time of death, nor do we intend to. We have independent factual basis for that. So there's no foundational aspect to this. Second of all, it is complete hearsay. There's information in a report, and counsel has the burden of establishing this as an official record. And it is hearsay upon hearsay, and hence still inadmissible.
Your Honor, if the people are going to contend that a case report from the county coroner as part of the autopsy report is not the official record, we'll take the time to establish that foundation.
Well, at this point, it's hearsay, and the witness not being a peace officer, there is no exception to his being able to relate hearsay. So at this point, the objection is sustained.
In forming any conclusions or opinions in your case, did you at all consider the time the decedent, Nicole Simpson Brown, was pronounced dead?
Objection, Your Honor. No foundation in evidence thus far, and a bit ambiguous as to which conclusions and opinions that counsel is interested in.
Sustained.
You testified that it was part of your job to determine the time of death.
Objection, Your Honor. This states the evidence.
Is that part of your job? To determine the time of death?
Yes, only I would use the term estimate or range of the time of death.
The objection's overruled.
And what factors did you use to estimate the time of death or range of time of death for the decedent, Ms. Brown?
Objection. This states the evidence. This witness has not made an estimate at the time of death.
Well, we haven't heard of an estimate as to time of death. So it assumes fact that's not in evidence yet.
Have you made an estimate in your official reports, or has anyone from the coroner's office made an estimate as to the time of death of the decedent, Mrs. Brown?
Objection, cuffed out.
Sustained as to someone other than this witness.
I'm sorry?
It would be sustained as to whether someone other than this particular witness made such an estimate.
Did you make an estimate as to the time of death?
There's no official estimate in my report. There's nothing written down.
I'm asking you, have you made an estimate? Did anybody ask you, as the head person investigating this homicide, to make an estimate as to the time of death? Yes or no?
Objection, that misstates the evidence. He's not the head person investigating this homicide.
Well, I think we know what he means. Overruled. Has that been asked of you?
Yes?
Who asked that of you?
Well, my boss, Dr. Lakshmanan.
Did you give him an answer?
Yes?
What was your answer?
My answer was...
Are you referring to something?
No.
It looks like you're reading something to me. Maybe it'd be simpler that if you need to refer to something, if you could put that aside, and then if you need to refer to it, just ask us. Would that work for you?
Surely.
Okay. Would you kindly put that aside? Now, would you tell us what you told your boss, Dr. Lakshmanan, regarding your estimate of the time of death of Nicole Brown?
My estimate was based on the state of the gastric contents and the character of her gastric contents. It was somewhere 3 to 4 hours after her last meal.
Now, that was the only factor you relied upon out of the 5 or 6 factors that you listed?
No, I haven't finished yet.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Then using that evidence, along with the body temperature determinations, which were taken approximately 11 hours after the body was discovered, I used formula graphs to reach a conclusion that the range of the time of death was somewhere between 10 and 15 hours prior to the time the investigator took the liver temperature determination.
So you used 2 of the 5 criteria. Is that correct?
And
Oh, you haven't finished yet.
And then considering the rigor mortis determination, which at the time the investigator performed her determination, the body was in full rigor. Now I may pick up and look at page 1 of the coroner's protocol. The rigor mortis was fixed and was fully fixed. So that also placed the time of death somewhere beyond 9 to 12 hours. In other words, it was fully fixed at the time, which was probably known at the time of the pronouncement of death. And livor mortis was also fixed, and rigor mortis was fully established. So four of the measurements or examinations were performed.
Let's go through each one of those, if we might. Regarding rigor mortis, what time does the case report that you've just referred to indicate that an observation for rigor mortis was first done by somebody from your department?
It was fully established You know, the interesting thing is the air and liver temperature times are given, date and time. The Leiber and rigor mortis statements do not have an exact date and time listing, but it's taken on or about the time the liver temperature is taken.
Which is what time?
Well, on Nicole Brown Simpson, liver temperature was taken at 10:50 hours on 6/13/94.
Would you agree that the closer you take, the closer that you make the observations of the 4 indications you've talked, well, the 3, let's not talk about stomach content. The closer you make the 3 observations to the time of death, the better chance you will have of accurately establishing parameters for time of death?
Yes.
And would you say that it's proper procedure if a decedent was found at approximately 10 minutes after midnight to wait 10.5 hours to perform these temperature evaluations?
Objection, Your Honor. They can ambiguous as to what is proper procedure.
Do you understand the question, Doctor?
Yes?
All right, then I'm going to go ahead and let you answer.
The measurements are more accurate the closer to the actual time of death.
And are there people available from the coroner's office to make those measurements at the request of homicide detectives?
Yes.
Now, regarding the stomach contents, you say that was something important that you use as a criteria for establishing the estimated time of death of the decedent Nicole Brown. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I take it those stomach contents are materials that can be preserved for later analysis. Is that correct?
Can be, yes.
And in fact, on the forms that you use, there's a checkbox for toxicological specimens collected. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Did you save the stomach contents?
No.
Were you able to determine who died first, the decedent Goldman or the decedent Brown?
No.
Do you have an opinion as to the time of death of Nicole Simpson?
I give you a range.
What is that range?
Somewhere between 9 o'clock and midnight.
Now, is there something in the report that indicates that one of your investigators had information from the mother of the decedent that she was alive at 11 p.m.?
Your Honor, I'm going to object now because counsel is attempting to elicit inadmissible and unreliable hearsay evidence.
I think it would be admissible only if the doctor relied upon it in formulating his opinion. And it would not be offered then for the truth of the matter, but for the fact that the doctor may have relied upon it. And I don't know whether he did or did not, and therefore until that foundation is established as to whether he relied upon that in forming his opinion, then the objection would be sustained.
Yes. I understand the court's ruling, and should it be permitted, it would be only for the limited purpose articulated by the court.
Correct.
Thank you.
Do you have any information from any investigator that's filed under a County of Los Angeles investigator's report for the Department of the Coroner regarding the last time somebody saw or spoke to Nicole Brown?
Yes?
What information did you have?
Am I allowed to testify on that? Or?
Your Honor, may I'm going to object for lack of foundation because there's no indication yet that this witness relied upon that information, whatever it is.
Yes, Mr. Shapiro, I think that you need to establish that foundationally before I would allow that testimony to come in.
Thank you. You previously testified that you read all these reports, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you read them?
Not in exact detail. I did look at them. In fact, some of these reports were preliminary. May not have been fully prepared at the time I did the autopsy.
When was the report that's we're referring to that has in the upper left-hand corner number 3 prepared?
The form number 3 prepared by investigator Radcliffe was prepared at 6/13/94.
Was that before or after your autopsy?
6/13/94 should have been prepared before the autopsy.
Have you had enough time to prepare yourself to testify in this case today?
Yes.
You had enough time to review your reports?
Yes.
Do you think you would need some more time to prepare yourself adequately for testimony?
Your Honor, I object. That's argumentative.
Sustained.
Is it your testimony that you did or did not consider the investigator's report before you have testified here today in any area?
I did consider those parts of the investigator's report that I considered relevant to my testimony, and I've already testified about her measurements that she took. That's the ones I've been asked about.
Is time of death relevant to your testimony?
Yes.
Didn't you just say that eyewitnesses are very important in establishing time of death?
Yes.
Would you consider a mother talking to her daughter as being an eyewitness to when somebody was last alive?
Well, I meant somebody actually witnessing the death. As often happens when death is pronounced in a hospital, we know the exact time of death.
What if somebody recorded the time of a telephone call? Would that be of any help to you?
Objection, Your Honor. That calls for speculation.
Overruled. Can you answer that? Are you able to answer them?
A telephone call to the decedent?
That is what you mean, isn't it,
Yes.
Mr. Shapiro? Yes.
Yes, that would be useful.
Is there anything that was done by anybody from the coroner's office to try to ascertain that?
Objection. That calls for speculation.
Has the official reports you can look at?
Overruled. You can answer.
Yes.
What is it?
And, Your Honor, now I will object on the grounds that counsel is attempting to elicit hearsay, and hearsay of a potentially unreliable nature. There is an addendum to the report to which counsel is referring, which states, in part, that this following information summary is based on preliminary information and cannot be completely verified at the time of this report. In addition, what counsel is attempting to elicit does not fall with an exception to the hearsay rule, even though contained in what may be characterized as an official record, you still have second-level hearsay. So on all those grounds, I object.
I still don't think, Mr. Shapiro, that you've established the foundation that the court felt needed to be established before that information could come in for the limited purpose for which the doctor considered it. if he indeed considered it. I don't know whether he did. That's the foundation that has not been established.
I believe, Your Honor, he has testified that an eyewitness to, or somebody establishing the time the decedent was last known alive would be one of 6 factors he would consider in establishing time of death.
I understand that, but specifically in this case, there's been no testimony that he in fact did rely upon any statement from someone indicating that they had had a telephone conversation with the decedent. And that's what you need to establish before I'll allow that testimony, and for a limited purpose only, not for the truth of the matter.
If you had some information as to the time the decedent was last talking to her mother, would that be of any benefit to you in coming to your estimate as to the time of death?
My estimates are based on the body measurements. I did not use any information about a telephone conversation.
Did you see any information about a telephone conversation when you came to your conclusions?
I heard about a telephone conversation and did see it in the report.
Who'd you hear about it from?
The initial report of the telephone conversation?
Yes.
I believe I heard it on the news or in the paper.
Is that before you saw it in your report?
Yes.
You mean the news had it on before it was in your investigator's report on the 13th?
I believe the news used the investigator's report, preliminary investigator's report.
Are you saying the news read the report before you did?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all.
My question now is...
All I'm saying is I did not use any telephone conversation to come to this time of death determination. I'm using body measurements and rigor mortis, livor mortis, cooling of the body, and gastric contents. That has nothing to do with a telephone conversation.
That's 10.5 hours after the fact. And you would rather rely upon that than upon a mother's testimony that she talked, or a mother's comment that she had a telephone conversation with her daughter? Which one do you think is more accurate?
Among other things, sustained.
Okay, we'll go on to something. We'll go on to something else. Do you have an opinion? You observed the stomach contents of the decedent, Mr. Goldman, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you save those?
Yes.
Why'd you save his and not save hers?
Well, first of all, I did not think it was indicated to save the contents on the cold brown Simpson. It was important to measure it, characterize it, describe it, and I did not think it was indicated to save it for toxicological examination. Of course, saving blood and other body fluids was very important for toxicological examination, which is what we did. The duty to characterize the gastric contents and measure it and describe what was in it was important, which is what I did. On Mr. Goldman, again, blood and other body fluids were preserved. On him, I was asked to save the gastric contents.
Who asked you to do that?
My chief supervisor, Dr. Lakshmanan.
Do you have an opinion as to, between Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman, who was the last one to consume food?
I have no opinion on that, no.
Did you form any conclusion or opinion as to whose food was more digested in the stomach?
Mr. Goldman's food was more digested than Nicole Brown Simpson's.
If he ate after she did, would that mean that he lived longer than she did?
If he had a meal after she had a meal,
Yes.
does this indicate that he lived longer than she did?
Yes.
Well, I don't know for sure. His state of the food being more digested in his stomach could indicate that he had the meal earlier, or that he had a lighter meal, and that digestion started sooner, whereas her food being in a less digested state. Particularly what I observed, a lot of the food appeared to be unchewed, particularly some of the particles of rigatoni were unchewed, and that could indicate that the unchewed food could remain in the stomach for a longer period of time before digestion.
Regarding the knife wounds, is it your findings that there were 2 types of knife wounds on both victims?
There are 2 morphologically different types of stab wounds on the victims. Namely, some of the stab wounds on the victims are indicative of a single-edged blade for the reasons that I indicated. They have both a round or blunt end and a pointed end. And some of the wounds have a characteristically double-pointed or forked end, which would indicate that they could be made by either a blunt end instrument or knife or a double sharp end instrument. In other words, a 2-edged knife or a single-edged knife. And there's no way that my determinations can tell the difference between those. So there are 2 morphologically different types.
Could 2 knives have produced the injuries on both of the victims?
Yes.
Was there any evidence of any sexual attack on the decedent, Nicole Brown?
No, there wasn't.
Did you look for any semen, saliva, hairs, bloods that might be left behind on the victim of a sexual attack?
Okay, that would be performed by a criminalist to collect and preserve that evidence, and I wouldn't do it, and it's my understanding that it was not requested or performed.
Was there any attempt made to look for semen in Nicole or Mr. Goldman at the scene or at the autopsy?
Not to my knowledge.
Is it proper, in your opinion, to do a rape kit analysis on young women murder victims as a general rule?
The circumstances would dictate whether that procedure would be performed, and the investigators are the ones who would initiate that request.
Detective Van Adder brought you a knife to examine.
Yes, he did.
When was that?
Wednesday, so that would be Wednesday, June 15th.
Was he alone when he brought that to you?
Yes.
Where were you when you received that knife?
I was in my office at the coroner's office.
Did he give you a chance to examine the knife?
Briefly.
Did you ask him, did you tell him you might have needed, did you need more time than he gave you to examine it?
For an accurate scientific examination, yes.
Did you tell him that?
No.
Why not?
I didn't think it was indicated.
Wait, a detective who's in charge of a homicide comes in with a knife, and he tells you this may be similar to the murder weapon. Is that correct?
Yes.
He asks you to check to see, and you're telling us that you didn't think it was indicated for you to perform a proper evaluation?
Well, I said it could be the weapon that caused some of the wounds, including the cutting wounds. It was a single edge. It had a single sharp cutting edge, and it's obviously consistent with many of the slashing wounds. And it was a 6-inch blade. And at the time, we didn't think it indicated, or I didn't think it indicated to go through each wound by wound, just to try to exclude that weapon. That can be done at some other time.
You understand a man is sitting in jail faced with charges of double homicide, do you not?
Yes.
Well, when could that be done to protect his rights?
Objection.
Sustained.
When would you suggest doing that to protect his rights?
Same objection.
Sustained is the form of the question.
When would you suggest doing these tests?
Now?
I have nothing further.
Mr. Hodgman?
If I may, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Golden, with regard to your testimony today regarding time of death, these are estimations, are they not?
Yes.
These are approximations, are they not?
Yes.
And there is not a way, even based upon the criteria articulated in court this afternoon, for you to pinpoint a time of death. Is that correct?
Yes.
The best you can do is give us a range of time in which time of death might have occurred. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is an approximation at best, is it not?
Yes.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Mr. Shapiro, anything further?
This witness may be excused.
Thank you, Doctor. You may step down. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone but the attorneys involved.
Your Honor, people would ask that all of the exhibits marked, with exception of the originally marked people's 4 and 5, be admitted into evidence.
All right, that would be exhibits number 1 through 33, with the exception of people's 4 and 5. Mr. Shapiro, do you have any objection to the receipt of those exhibits?
No objection.
Thank you, Mr. Ullman. People's 1 through 33, with the exception of 4 and 5, are received in evidence at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. People rest.
Will there be any affirmative defense or other evidence offered by the defense?
Your Honor, we did proffer a stipulation and change the settlement. People are willing to accept that stipulation.
There's no evidence to support the stipulation proffered. There will be no stipulation.
All All right, did you wish to offer any of your exhibits that had been offered in connection with the motion to suppress?
Yes, we do.
All right. That would be defense A, B, C, D. The court did not allow E, G, or H. So are you seeking to offer only A, B, C, D, and F at this time?
Yes, sir.
Any objection?
No objection.
Those items are received from the defense. Do you have any motions at this time?
Before we begin considering an affirmative defense, there would be a motion to dismiss the case.
I'm sorry, you say before you begin considering an
Yes,
affirmative
I think
defense?
At this point in time, we would like to make a motion that is dismissed.
That motion is denied. Did you wish to present an affirmative defense? Yes.
Perhaps we might suggest a 5-minute recess and further council.
All right.
Is once again in session.
All right, we're once again on the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. People are represented. Mr. Shapiro.
I have decided not to present any affirmative evidence at this time.
All right. Do you have any other motions that you wish to make at this time or be heard with regard to any motions?
Yes, sir. I would like to be heard on motion to dismiss.
I'll hear you at this time.
Thank you. Would you like me to go to the podium? Or stand here?
I think the podium is probably better.
Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider the jury instruction that would be given in a case like this regarding circumstantial evidence. And that is, if the evidence presented relies solely on circumstantial evidence, there can be no conviction unless the circumstances point to guilt and are not reconcilable with any other reasonable theory. If, on the other hand, the circumstances may point to guilt or may point to innocence, the jury or finder of fact must adopt that theory which points to innocence and reject that which points to guilt. Now, clearly, this is not a trial. And clearly, the burden is not the same. But the legal principle remains. This is a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. And it is clear from the presentation of the people and through our cross-examination that the circumstances can point both towards a suspicion of guilt and also towards a theory of innocence. The key piece of evidence that the people are relying on is the serology of a 99% chance that 4 blood drops found at the Bundy crime scene were of the same type and chemical composition of that of Mr. O.J. Simpson.
Objection, that's a misstatement of the evidence.
This is argument, Ms. Clark. You can be heard in response at the appropriate time.
The converse of that is that if you take the Coliseum on any given Sunday, 40,000 to 80,000 people will have that same blood type. Number 2, there was testimony elicited from the people's witness that Mr. Simpson has joint custody of these children with his ex-wife, the decedent, Nicole. That being the case, it is reasonable to assume that he would visit the children or pick them up at her condominium on a regular basis. Since the criminalist cannot fix the age of the blood spots, there is an equally reasonable theory that those blood spots if in fact they belong to Mr. Simpson, were placed there at some other time than at the time of death. And in fact, the criminalist testified that by viewing the photographs, the blood appeared to be of different ages. However, he blamed that on poor photography. But on cross-examination, he admitted that proper crime scene photography requires using the same type of equipment with the same lighting conditions from the same angle. Point number 2 that the prosecution relies on. There is a matching glove found in the debris behind the Simpson residence that matches a glove found at the crime scene. Let's go by the testimony. I asked Deputy Van Adder, how did that glove get there? He said, someone brought it there. Let's look at the other circumstantial evidence involved. If, in fact, the killer lived at the Simpson residence, the court would have to believe the following: that in a window period of less than an hour, the killer was able to leave the crime scene that has been described with a victim with 2 arteries in the neck cut, 2 jugular veins cut, and massive blood from both victims. A clear inference would be that the murderer was indeed covered with blood. The murderer would then have to do the following: abandon the bloody clothing because they have not been found or presented, abandon the murder weapon because that has not been found or discovered, abandon bloody shoes because they have not been found or discovered, and then go back to his house and leave a bloody glove in his backyard. That just doesn't stand up to logic. We have no evidence whatsoever in this record that whoever committed this horrendous act acted with premeditation and deliberation, as is charged in the complaint filed by the district attorney. This is a case that the police admit is still under investigation, where other suspects are being sought, where the medical examiner admits that 2 weapons could have been used. A clear inference that there may be more than one killer. I don't want to go through each and every area of impeachment with the witnesses, but I think it is very, very clear that everybody who has participated in this investigation has not done so in a professional manner. From the time the Los Angeles Police Department arrived on the crime scene, it was nearly 10 hours later until they started the scientific investigation and even took the temperature of the body. There was testimony that the fire department obviously was there and left and didn't do anything, yet the coroner's records clearly indicate that the fire department chief was the person who pronounced the bodies dead. I doubt if he did that from a distance. This is a case that everybody has jumped to an immediate and unrealistic conclusion.
Present with counsel, people are represented. Mr. Shapiro.
I have decided not to present any affirmative evidence at this time.
All right. Do you have any other motions that you wish to make at this time or be heard with regard to any motions?
Yes, Your Honor, I would like to be heard on motion to dismiss.
I'll hear you at this time.
Thank you. Would you like me to go to the podium or stand here?
I think the podium is probably better.
Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider the jury instruction that would be given in a case like this regarding circumstantial evidence. And that is, if the evidence presented relies solely on circumstantial evidence, there can be no conviction unless the circumstances point to guilt and are not reconcilable with any other reasonable theory. If, on the other hand, the circumstances may point to guilt or may point to innocence, the jury or finder of fact must adopt that theory which points to innocence and reject that which points to guilt. Now, clearly, this is not a trial, and clearly the burden is not the same. But the legal principle remains. This is a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. And it is clear from the presentation of the people and through our cross-examination that the circumstances can point both towards a suspicion of guilt and also towards a theory of innocence. The key piece of evidence that the people are relying on is the serology of a 99% chance that 4 blood drops found at the Bundy crime scene were of the same type and chemical composition of that of Mr. O.J. Simpson.
Objection, that's a misstatement of the evidence.
This is argument, Ms. Clark. You can be heard in response at the appropriate time.
The converse of that is that if you take the Coliseum on any given Sunday, 40,000 to 80,000 people will have that same blood type. Number 2, there was testimony elicited from the people's witness that Mr. Simpson has joint custody of these children with his ex-wife, the decedent, Nicole. That being the case, it is reasonable to assume that he would visit the children or pick them up at her condominium on a regular basis. Since the criminalist cannot fix the age of the blood spots, there is an equally reasonable theory that those blood spots, if in fact they belong to Mr. Simpson, were placed there at some other time than at the time of death. And in fact, the criminalist testified that by viewing the photographs, the blood appeared to be of different ages. However, he blamed that on poor photography. But on cross-examination, he admitted that proper crime scene photography requires using the same type of equipment with the same lighting conditions from the same angle. Point number 2 that the prosecution relies on. There is a matching glove found in the debris behind the Simpson residence that matches a glove found at the crime scene. Let's go by the testimony. I asked Deputy Van Adder, how did that glove get there? He said, someone brought it there. Let's look at the other circumstantial evidence involved. If, in fact, the killer lived at the Simpson residence, the court would have to believe the following: that in a window period of less than an hour, the killer was able to leave the crime scene that has been described with a victim with 2 arteries in the neck cut, 2 jugular veins cut, and massive blood from both victims. A clear inference would be that the murderer was indeed covered with blood. The murderer would then have to do the following: abandon the bloody clothing because they have not been found or presented, abandon the murder weapon because that has not been found or discovered, abandon bloody shoes because they have not been found or discovered, and then go back to his house and leave a bloody glove in his backyard. That just doesn't stand up to logic. We have no evidence whatsoever in this record that whoever committed this horrendous act acted with premeditation and deliberation, as is charged in the complaint filed by the district attorney. This is a case that the police admit is still under investigation, where other suspects are being sought, where the medical examiner admits that 2 weapons could have been used. A clear inference that there may be more than one killer. I don't want to go through each and every area of impeachment with the witnesses, but I think it is very, very clear that everybody who has participated in this investigation has not done so in a professional manner. From the time the Los Angeles Police Department arrived on the crime scene, it was nearly 10 hours later until they started the scientific investigation and even took the temperature of the body. There was testimony that the fire department obviously was there and left and didn't do anything, yet the coroner's records clearly indicate that the fire department chief was the person who pronounced the body's dead. I doubt if he did that from a distance. This is a case that everybody has jumped to an immediate and unrealistic conclusion as to the state of this evidence. This is a case that is not ready yet to come to court. This is a case where the chief serologist said we use serology as much to eliminate as to implicate, and yet we have no DNA testing back. This is a case that is needless and groundless and does not warrant any further consideration at this point in time. The court, on viewing all of the evidence that has been presented from the witness stand, should have little difficulty in deciding that this certainly is not a case of any premeditated murder by anyone, for there is totally no evidence on that issue whatsoever. And number two, that there is not and cannot be at this point in time a strong suspicion that Mr. Simpson is guilty of anything. Therefore, Your Honor, it is incumbent upon you to exercise your duties under the law and dismiss this case.
Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Your Honor. In order to find in this case, Your Honor, that there is no strong suspicion to believe the defendant has committed the crimes that he is charged with, you would have to ignore all of the evidence. And the evidence is consistent and very powerful, even at this early stage of the case, to indicate that the defendant has indeed committed every crime that he is charged with. As I'm sure this court is aware, there need be no finding with respect to the degree of the murders charged at this time. I will address the issue of the sufficiency of the evidence to prove premeditation, however, if the court desires. But I will leave that for now unless and until the court asks me to address that issue, because I do think the evidence is clearly sufficient to show that these crimes were premeditated murders. With respect to the issue of circumstantial evidence, as usual, as is typical, counsel picks one part away and says that's not enough, and takes another part away and says that's not enough. And of course, if you pick apart any case, any one bit singly may not be enough to prove the entire case, nor should it be, because circumstantial evidence, being one of the stronger ways to prove guilt, requires a number of pieces of evidence to amount to proof that will prove the defendant committed the crimes charged. This case is no exception. Rather than relying on the testimony of an eyewitness who may be mistaken, who may be under stress, seeing a defendant flee from a scene perhaps with poor lighting, never having seen that person before, and glimpsing them for a split second, that's direct evidence. But as the court knows, a fingerprint is circumstantial evidence. A circumstantial evidence in that way is very, very reliable and is much stronger because it does rely on many factors for its proof rather than one single one. This is a physical evidence case, and the physical evidence and the inferences to be drawn therefrom are powerful. First of all, the killer in this case was clearly injured during the commission of these murders. He left a trail of blood leading away from the victims to the rear of the residence and out to the alley. A trail of blood was found from the defendant's Ford Bronco leading up the driveway to his front door. And I would remind the court that the distance between the two locations is a mere 2 miles approximately. Certainly not enough time for whatever injury was sustained at the time of the attack to have healed sufficiently so that he would not bleed, unless he was holding something in his hands that would stop the blood. Now, the fact that we failed to find the bloody shoes that clearly were worn from the scene, although we did find a bloody glove, is hardly illogical at all. The reason we found the bloody glove was simply accident, the defendant's misfortune. It was clearly his intent. At the time the thumps were heard by Cato, he was back there trying to hide things or look for a place to secrete them and dropped the glove inadvertently. Had he known he dropped the glove, obviously we would never have found that either. But that was not the case. He did drop the glove, not intentionally, but by accident. Secondly, the bloody glove that was found at the crime scene is left-handed. That's a very important fact. The bloody shoe prints leaving that crime scene, with blood drops alongside them, were to the left of those shoe prints. That shows us that the killer was injured somewhere on his left side. The blood on the driver's door handle of the Ford Bronco would logically be opened with the left hand. And it's no coincidence that we just happened to find the blood spot on the driver's door handle. And now I know that the testimony to this time, Your Honor, has indicated that it was positive as an indication of blood, but not tested to be human or animal. But the last time I checked, dogs don't drive cars, and at least not Ford Broncos, and I think we can draw a reasonable inference that it was a human who left the blood on the door handle of a car. And those reasonable inferences are precisely what the court is required to draw from all of the evidence, the reasonable inferences. Now, on the day that the defendant returned from Chicago, Detective Van Adder makes the observation that after having seen the left-handed bloody glove left at the crime scene that clearly came off during the struggle, which is what allowed him to get the cut that left the blood drops to the left of the footprints and left us the blood drops on the driver's handle door, he sees the defendant with a bandage around his middle left finger. And then he takes him down to Parker Center, where he sees again that he has, and we've shown the picture to the court, a swollen finger on the left hand with a cut that was dressed and treated at Parker Center. No coincidence. Third, the right-handed mate to that glove is found on the defendant's property at, I think it was mere hours after the crimes were committed, in a dark, narrow area, obviously where there was some clandestine activity designed to hide evidence, during which time it was inadvertently dropped. And that discovery was made after Cato Kalin indicated he heard the 3 thumps against the wall. Someone fell against that wall, and that someone was the defendant. And in that process, lost the right-handed glove. And a presumptive test on that glove for blood came up positive. Fourth, the defendant clearly lied to the limousine driver, Alan Park. When Alan Park drove down to the Rockingham gate at about 10:40, the Ford Bronco was not there. Between 10:40 and 10:55, he rang the intercom repeatedly, and he received no answer. It was only when 15 minutes later, after Park had just seen a black person 6 feet, 200 pounds, walk quickly up the drive and into the front door, that the intercom was finally answered by the defendant. Before that person, 6 feet, 200 pounds, entered the house through a front door that Cato said was kept locked, all downstairs lights were off. Immediately after that person entered the house, all the lights went on. And 30 seconds later, the defendant answered the intercom where previously he had failed to do so. Now, it must be obvious to everyone at this point that the person seen entering the house by Alan Park was the defendant. But he lied to the limousine driver, and it's a very significant lie. Because why would he need to do that? Why not just say, I was out getting some last minute things. I had to go shopping. I had to go to the store. I had to go get something from the 7-Eleven. He could have said anything. But it's very significant that he chose to lie to the limo driver at all, and the lie he chose to tell. What lie did he tell? He said, oh, I overslept. I just got out of the shower. We know that's not true. He was seen just going into the house 30 seconds before. The only reason to tell such a lie is that the defendant is trying to set up an alibi for the time when he knows the murders occurred. A very significant piece of evidence. Fifth, the blood drop on the trail leading away from the victims at 875 South Bundy. Testing revealed that only 43% of the population could have been the source of that blood drop.
Is that 43% or 0.43%?
0.43%, thank you, Your Honor, 0.43. Now, what's interesting is on cross-examination, counsel attempted to elicit the possibility that that stain might reflect that two people left that blood drop on the trail. If that's true, we do know this. At least one of them had all of the markers that can be attributed to the defendant, who is within 0.43% of the population that could have left that blood drop. And of the 43% of the population that could have been the source, the 0.43% that could have been the source of that blood drop, how many had a bloody glove found on their property mere hours after the murders occurred? A bloody glove that matched the bloody glove found at the crime scene, at the feet of one of the victims. That must considerably narrow down that figure. And so it's not just 99.57% of the population that is excluded, but virtually everyone but the defendant, when all of the evidence is taken into account, Your Honor. And in light of all of the evidence that we have presented, the people have more than established and carried their burden with respect to this preliminary hearing, and I submit that the defendant should be held to answer for all of the charges as charged in the complaint. Thank you.
All right, at this time, the court will take a 15-minute recess. I will announce my ruling at 3 o'clock.
See.
All right, we're once again on the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. The people are represented. The court has carefully considered the evidence in this case and the arguments of counsel. And keeping in mind that the proof in this matter is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the court feels that there is ample evidence to establish a strong suspicion of the guilt of the accused, and therefore the motion to dismiss is denied at this time. I want to make one comment with regard to the envelope, and that is this, that envelope at this time remains sealed, that the contents of that envelope, whatever they may be, in no way played a part in the proceeding or the decision in this matter. That envelope in a sealed condition will be transferred along with the court file to the Superior Court for such further rulings as are appropriate at a future point in time. Defendant, please stand. It appearing to me from the evidence presented that the following offenses have been committed, and there is sufficient cause to believe this defendant guilty of count 1, a violation of Penal Code Section 187A, with a special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 12022B, and count 2, a violation of Penal Code Section 187A, with a special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 12022B, and also that there's sufficient evidence of the special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 190.2A3. The court holds that the defendant be held to answer therefore, that there be no bail allowed in this case, and that the defendant be committed to the custody of the Sheriff of Los Angeles County. Date of arraignment in the Superior Court will be July the 22nd at 8:30 in Department 100. The defendant is remanded at this time, and this court is adjourned.